Brilliant. I'll go on mute and I'll go off camera, and it's over to yourselves.
Welcome to the latest edition of the Evershed Southern Labour Exchange podcast. My name's Tom Player. I'm partner and head of Labour and Industrial Relations for the firm. We run this podcast every 3 months to talk about a pertinent topic on industrial relations and labour. There's no shortage of those topics at the moment as we move very quickly towards the likely royal assent of the Employment Rights Bill, which is the government's flagship piece of employment and labour legislation, which is working its way through Parliament. Today, we're going to focus on one particular aspect of that bill, which is the future for strikes and industrial action and the government's planned changes to industrial action laws in the new bill. Just to put it into some sort of context, we know during the last government that there were lots of strengthening and tightening of industrial action laws, increasing notice periods, making the thresholds for legitimate and protected and official strike action more difficult to achieve. And historically, there have been employers that have sought to challenge industrial action ballots on legal grounds, challenging notices, etc. I'm very pleased to be joined by Emma Humphreys, a partner and specialist in strikes and industrial action in our team here, to explore what's changing, when it's changing, and how employers can prepare. Welcome, Emma.
Thanks, Tom. Good to be here.
Okay, great. Just a bit of background from me first. Strikes come and go, as we know. If you pick up the press, and there's been strikes in the news recently, sometimes there is a little bit of press hysteria about whether we might be facing some form of winter of discontent. Just to put that into context, I've been looking at the latest industrial action statistics. In 2023, there were a total of 2,218,000 days lost through strike action. That's a startlingly high number and was really the high point. In 2024, that dropped to 477,000 days lost. And in 2025, in the first 6 months, only 89,000 days were lost to strike action. So this points to a very significant decline in strike and industrial action since the peak in 2023. A better way of looking at that actually is that in the first quarter of 2025, approximately 17,000 workers in the UK were involved in some form of industrial dispute. By contrast, in 2022 and 23, over 660,000 workers were involved in strikes and disputes. So what's causing that? Well, we know that we've had a change of government 18 months ago. We're now just over a year through the new Labour government. They have promised new rights for trade unions in terms of access, in terms of weakening of trade union recognition laws, and enabling unions to follow a more straightforward process for organising official and protected action. So that's probably led to the unions maybe giving the new government a bit of a break, a bit of a rest to get their house in order before taking strikes. But we also know that there's been a lot of political upheaval in the last week or so with the resignation of the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, who's very closely associated with the ER bill, but also a change in business secretary with Jonathan Reynolds leaving the government and Justin Madders, the employment minister, going. So there's been some anxiety from trade unions about whether the bill might be diluted and whether they can still expect all of the changes to come through and in the timescales that the government have published. We have to wait and see what happens on that. What I think is fair to say is we will likely get royal assent on the bill this autumn. When? We'll have to wait till after the conference season. So we thought it was a really good time to drill into the industrial action and strike position and what's going to change and what will it mean for business and what will it mean for industry. So Emma, welcome again.
Thank you.
We know that the government have committed to row back on many of the industrial action laws from the previous government as part of the ER bill. That is likely to make it easier and quicker to organise official industrial action. But what can we expect from day one, immediately when this bill is passed later in the autumn?
Yeah. So essentially what is going to go immediately is the legislation that was introduced towards the back end of 2023 on minimum service levels. And that was legislation introduced to require in certain public sector strikes that a minimum level of service be provided in certain circumstances. In fact, that legislation's never been utilised in practice. So this isn't going to be a huge kind of practical of a huge practical significance to employers, but that is sort of signposting the criticism that that legislation received at the time, and the current government's view of that, obviously. So that's going to go immediately. And we know as well that the government's intending to implement further consultations on trade union matters, including things like electronic and workplace balloting. And no doubt we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly.
Yeah, right. So not much immediately. Some
No.
abolition of laws that have never been used and never saw the light of day. Some consultations on things like e-balloting, which is significant. I agree with you. But we also know that they're looking at things like the amount of notice that unions must give employers, and how long industrial action might last for. So what other changes are going to be or are planned with this new act and will be implemented, and sort of dates and when that might happen, please?
Yeah, sure. So 2 months after the bill receives royal assent, we know that there are a number of trade union industrial action changes that are going to take place. So initially on that 2 months date, we've got, as you've mentioned, reducing the advance notice of industrial action from 14 days to 10 days. So employers are going to have less time to prepare. The expiry of the ballot mandate is going to be extended from 6 to 12 months. So we have a risk of disputes potentially lasting longer. In certain important public service strikes, the moment there is an additional threshold of 40% support for ballot mandates. At the moment, that 40% support threshold is also going to go.
Right.
Initially, the 50% turnout threshold is going to not be affected initially, but put a pin in that, because watch this space, that's changing as well, but not at that 2-month date. There's also going to be a reduction of information on the ballot paper. So the most significant of those changes, I think, is that the union is no longer going to need to tell its members what types of action short of strike that the union is intending to take. So employers aren't going to have sort of advance warning of what types of action short of strike the union is going to take either. Picket supervision requirements are going to go as well. So query whether that's going to have an impact on how picket lines are managed and the behaviours we see on those picket lines. And we're also going to see changes to the information to be provided to employers on the ballot notice and the industrial action notice. So at the moment on the ballot notice, the union has to give a list of categories and numbers in each category, and a list of workplaces and the numbers in each workplace, as well as the total number of workers affected. What the union is going to have to provide in the ballot notice is just the total number and the list of workplaces and the list of categories. So it's not going to be as easy for employers to identify how many in each category or how many in each workplace, for example. And slightly oddly, perhaps, there's slightly different requirements in the industrial action notice. So it doesn't, the requirements aren't going to mirror one another. We're also going to see protection against dismissal for taking industrial action being enhanced. So there's going to be a removal of the 12-week protected period. That's just going to be an indefinite protected period now for anyone that takes part in protected industrial action. So there's quite a lot changing in those 2 months. And that isn't the end of it, Tom, because we've then got in April 26, the government has signposted in its roadmap that that is when electronic balloting will come into force. And when electronic balloting comes into force, the 50% turnout threshold for strikes will also be removed. So
Right.
at the moment,
Can we just pause on that? So what does that mean? Postal ballots at the moment, so may discourage people from voting. What do you think will be the effects of this e-balloting and this, presumably if they don't need to get a certain threshold, it'll just be a simple majority of those that vote from the union,
that's right.
which would sanction the industrial action. Is that right?
Yeah. So at the moment, if you had 100 people that were, entitled to vote in the ballot, at least 50 would need to turn out, and then the union would just need a simple majority of that 50 to get over the line. But what will happen when e-balloting comes into place is that 50% turnout will go. So if you've got 100 people entitled to vote, if just 3 people vote, so long as 2 of them vote in favour, that will be sufficient to secure a mandate. Now, I don't wish to scaremonger, because clearly a union that has a mandate of 2 people out of 100 is not going to feel particularly sort of confident or buoyed by that level of mandate. But it does just go to show that, that there's going to be potentially a lot lower numbers of employees that will have to participate in order for a union to secure a mandate and have some form of leverage in negotiations or whatever it may be. And
yeah, so thanks, Emma. And just a few thoughts on e-balloting and the significance of that and how big a deal we think that's going to be.
At the moment, obviously, postal ballots are expensive for you, particularly if you are balloting, thousands of members of staff, which we know, does happen. Obviously, electronic balloting is going to make those processes significantly cheaper for unions. And so query whether they will therefore, that there may not be a requirement for as much kind of consideration over the sort of cost that it's going to cost them versus, what they may, secure out of a ballot. Everyone these days, or most people these days, are more, use their phones, email, that they are more tech savvy than ever before. And it does mean that, I think that the idea behind it, I think, is to increase participation in ballots.
Right.
But some further thought needs to be given around how are we going to make sure that electronic balloting is safe and secure and free from undue sort of interference or influence. At the moment, people receive their ballot paper in post at home. Instead, it may be on their mobile phone. People may get together in the workplace or elsewhere and sort of discuss or the union may oversee, the employer may, there is just more scope for potential interference with how people are going to vote.
And just I cut you off mid-flow. Were there any other changes that you wanted to just touch on briefly, or is that about the size of it before we look at key challenges for employers?
I think the only other change that I would flag is not anticipated till October 26, and it's not directly related to industrial action, but it is around extending protection against detriment for taking part in industrial action, sort of plug a gap in our existing law.
Right. Okay. So it's going to be very important for employers when they're dealing with strikes and other industrial action to know what's fair and reasonable in terms of how to manage the workforce during a dispute.
Absolutely, and how you're going to encourage or disincentivize, but ensuring that you do that in a lawful way.
Understood fully. And then in the last few minutes, Emma, I'd be really interested to know what you think the key challenges for employers are, and really how they prepare for what's going to be a significant change. I mean, there's a lot in what you've said.
I mean, a key challenge is going to be around contingency planning. Some of the points that I've already mentioned around reduced notice, reduced information, not knowing how many people in different categories or workplaces are going to be subject to the ballot, particularly in sort of safety critical environments. That's going to be very challenging for employers to really identify and understand where their sort of high risk areas are. So I think the key issue really is around how they are going to contingency plan, and also how they're going to resolve disputes when there's a potential mandate for 12 months, and where a union can reballot more easily than it currently can. So I think all of that puts additional pressure on employers in this sort of context.
Yeah.
In terms of what they could be doing now to prepare, I mean, it's sort of really trying to pre-plan what they can in terms of contingency. So can we be training managers or other wider workforce on particularly safety critical or business critical roles to ensure that there's adequate cover during strikes and industrial action? Is there any way in which work may be diverted or shared with different sites in the event of industrial action? See, that won't be relevant for some employers, but potentially for others. Are there any ways in which you can identify or think about outsourcing arrangements during industrial action? But also, I think there's sort of the softer side of this in terms of auditing your industrial relations strategy and your dispute resolution procedures. You know, are they fit for purpose?
Yeah.
Is it possible to negotiate a legally binding dispute resolution process and really hold parties to account on the resolution process? Reviewing existing relationships, you know, what's working well, and where are we seeing good practice? How can we implement that more widely, and how can we build a, you know, better and stronger industrial relations within the business?
Really, really helpful input and thought there. I think what really strikes home to me is this is
Pun intended.
yes, very good. Is that this is only a part of the labour industrial relations and trade union changes, and this point about employers starting to engage with what's contained in this bill and how it's going to potentially change workplace dynamics, and how you build constructive workplace relations to potentially minimize the risk of some of these issues arising, because it's fairly clear from our discussion that there will be an easier route for trade unions to pursue strikes, which is, you know, their democratic right. We respect that, but there will be implications for employers, and we're not always going to be living in a world of relatively low strikes and industrial action as the economy is challenged and the jobless total increases and wages come under pressure. These things will come to the fore, I'm sure. So thanks very much for sharing your thoughts, Emma. I'd just like to thank the listeners for joining today, and just make one flag. We have our Labour Relations Conference. It's in its 22nd year, taking place on the 13th of November in London this year. It's possible for people to book on the website to ensure that they can get a seat at that conference. It's selling very quickly. So if you'd like to hear more about the bill and like to hear more from Emma and our other colleagues and some excellent external speakers, please do come and join us in London on the 13th of November. So thanks for listening.
Thank you.